Michael Casey is here, telling us all about law and the blockchain, legal framework on blockchain. We're really happy that you've made it this afternoon. A keynote at the end.
So let me just start by talking a little bit about the DAO. You guys know what the DAO? Who knows what the DAO was? Right. This is the distributed autonomous organization that was created by some folks who were associated with Ethereum, and it was a really fancy new way to raise money with this big investment program, and there would be complete smart contract run, nobody in charge, and they would invest in whatever the contracts were going to say. No authority, no one in charge, right? A completely distributed autonomous organization. And it had a little problem because somebody figured out how to write a recursive smart contract in there that figured out how to actually just take all the money out of the system. And $50 million had been stolen, and it went up to about 150 million eventually. 50 million ultimately is what the guy got. And at the core of the problem was a number of things. One was, obviously, there was a bug in the code, and they hadn't thought this through. But the main thing, as far as I'm concerned, was the legal structure of what they'd come up with. Right? They basically said that there is no law other than the code. The code is always right, right? And so if you cannot sue anybody, there's no alternative because the code supersedes the law. So what that meant was this guy was able to say, and we don't even know if it was a guy or a woman for that matter, because the guy is the person, whoever the hacker, quite legitimately said, I wasn't hacking. I was exploiting a feature in the system. You told me I could write whatever program I could. It's an open system. The code wins, right? The code tells me I can take the money out. It was a perfectly legitimate claim. But of course, it's not really in the spirit of what's happening. So all the guys who'd put their money into it, the $150 million worth of investors, were irate. And they immediately appealed to the Ethereum founders who'd been behind this to roll back the code and try to get their money back. And then there was talk about lawsuits and class action suits and all sorts of things against those guys. And so the foundation rapidly pulled the thing together and came up with a way to do a fork and roll back the code and try to rescue some of the money. Ultimately, a system that said there is no law, we are the law, appealed back to the law. It was the threat of lawsuits, the reality of the outside world ensured that the Ethereum coders were compelled by the threat to roll everything back, because there is no such thing as the code being the law. And this is a really important point, because there's a guy called Lawrence Lessig, some of you would know, a very influential Harvard law professor, who coined this phrase, code is law. And he was actually misunderstood. He wasn't saying that code, that is software code, is a replacement of the broad concept of the law. He was saying that in the realm of cyberspace, where we operate in the internet realm, code functions as if it is law. It is the regulatory framework in which we govern our behavior. And that's absolutely true. But it's quite different to say our governed behavior within this subset of the world is somehow a complete alternative universe from the entire legal framework in which we all operate. So that means that raises the way to think about these things, because blockchain is like that, obviously, right? It's a cyberspace realm that has its own governance models. And that's really what I think of blockchain is. It's a governance system. It's a way for us to figure out how, through incentives and costs, to pursue all of our interests in a common way, right? But it lives within the broader realm of the law. And the law is actually something really quite profound when you think about it. Think of what common law is. It goes right back to the very beginnings of civilization. And we iteratively build upon it through case law and through iteration and debate and deliberation. And it's like the fabric of our society, the law, right? It's its essence, the judicial process, everything else, right? So, and if you think about that, then there's no way we could ever avoid that. That's the whole thing. But now, the question is, what do we do with this? Because truly cyberspace is a rapidly growing space for us, and blockchain is a realm in which all these other previously legally defined contracts are now going to kind of reside in this otherwise governed system that has its own regulatory framework. So figuring out how we merge into this meta world of the law is the real challenge, right? How do we integrate this cyberspace regulatory structure, that sort of law with a little l, into the law which is the big world, the big superstructure, right? And one of the ways that we need to think about it, I know you've been talking about identity today, is to think about how the law, capital L, is critical to the very notion of identity, right? How we define in a legal construct how we deal with each other comes down often to these legal definitions of personhood. And it's not just human beings, it's companies, right? Because a company is a legal person. So this notion of identity as a construct that we can now work with is defined by this broad legal framework. And given that we're now going to be essentially having machines that will interact with each other, we now just think about how we define that concept of identity into, that is the identity of the machine that may own its own coins, its own cryptocurrency, have its own contract that's running it, into this broad superstructure of the law. So that's our challenge right now, is to figure out how we integrate that superstructure with this new cyberspace world. And it's really, really important for blockchains, more so than just the internet and law challenge, which is, Lessig actually formed an institute called the Berkman Institute for Internet and Society. So it's really trying to grapple with this idea of society and the internet, how we interact with it. But because blockchain takes it to a completely other level, because there's money, there's value involved with blockchains. And where there is money and value, there is conflicts. And most importantly, there's also conflicts of interest. So this integration is critical. If you think about something like a smart contract, it can define the terms that you and I, Cohen and I, have an agreement, and it's now being executed in this environment. But what happens if there's a dispute? And as much as we might like to think that this perfect system is going to constantly work things out because we've written it into a code that we both agree upon, I think it's miraculous imagination beyond belief to think that there won't still be disputes. But even if we did arrive at that utopia, no company in their right mind is going to sign into a smart contract structure without the general counsel signing off on the fact that there is a dispute resolution mechanism that lives outside of that world. So everything has to work within this superstructure. So ultimately, this is where we need to go, but there's this way of thinking about it that I think is really important, because we could over-regulate, right? Because, okay, that's it. The problem is we've got to figure out how to put this new blockchain world into this legal framework. So we're going to regulate the technology, and we're going to place new laws about what blockchain is and what Bitcoin is, and effectively regulate the technology. And that's a recipe for disaster. If you sort of over-regulate technology, you just kill innovation. I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems we've had with that in a minute. So again, it's what it comes down to is how do we define and talk about our behavior with this technology and think about how it fits into this broader context. And sure, there may have to be some tweaking of legislation, but the real issue is we have this framework that is our society. How do we define the behavior within it and understand the behavior in it so that we can work within it and at the same time encourage innovation without killing it? But it's rather complicated because if you think again about a smart contract and maybe a supply chain environment, we have to think about what property is, about who has authority over that property and who can make decisions. And ultimately that authority and that action comes down to control of a private key. So who owns and controls that private key, and how do we define that, right? And it's a really sort of powerful thing to have. So these things become rather complicated. And there's a friend of mine, a guy called Pindar Wong, who founded a thing called the Belt and Road Blockchain Consortium out of Hong Kong. And he's been thinking hard about this, and he sort of, he realized that essentially they're going to have to figure out how to have the dispute resolution mechanism that exists outside of that realm. And in doing so, if a company, a corporate entity that wants to have a supply chain contract with another one, wants to build this sort of arbitration model, they need to, at some point, register their ownership and most importantly, their ownership authority structure of those keys. So it might be the CFO, and then there's maybe some multi-sig, there might be some other offices in there, and then there's a device. There's literally things that you own in the supply chain, a sensor and a some sort of QR code reader, and that's yours, and you need to place that within this framework. So there's this whole sort of hierarchical model that needs to be built around taking the machine. He talks about we need to define a model that he calls KYM. So it's know your machine, not just know your customer, right? Because we need to be able to identify that machine. It's going to own currency. It's going to have, contractual power registered in the device itself because of the smart contracts that we've created for them. So we need to know it. Who owns it? Who controls it, right? So, as you do that, you sort of move out of this cyberspace realm out into the real world of the CFO and who that person is and how he or she sits within the organizational structure of the organization. So you can see how under this framework, we're starting to think of interesting ways to merge the two. But you still have these issues. So the BRBC, the Belt and Road Blockchain Consortium, is called that because it's built as a solution for China's Belt and Road model, which is a 65-country, as you probably know, manufacturing solution. It's a massive undertaking that China's entering. But if you're going to have a supply chain smart contract with somebody and there is a dispute, in which jurisdiction does that reside? Right? So these questions come up, and it's, again, sort of one of the complicating things we need to figure out. Which legal structure? Because it's not just one. It has to be these other systems. And one of the ways to resolve that that they came up with was to think about the role that Hong Kong might take. So they're a little self-serving because it's a Hong Kong-based institution. But Hong Kong is an interesting way to think about this because at the end of the day, Hong Kong exists for the purpose of being a transitional point between East and West. The very reason why those skyscrapers in there, all those banks are there, is because they trust the property law and the property rights of Hong Kong. They don't necessarily trust those of China. One could imagine all the 65 countries along the Belt and Road system saying, I don't trust China, but maybe I trust Hong Kong. And I think that Pindar and his friends are actually trying to have a bit of a Trojan horse game here. They're trying to prove to China that they must protect the rule of law in Hong Kong, precisely so that this big system that they're trying to build with smart contracts and smart manufacturing can have a jurisdictional environment that everybody trusts. So this is, again, one way to think about all the challenges of that. But the other thing to say is that, you don't really want... you have to figure out how you don't burden court systems. If our only solution here is to say every smart contract is responsible to some legal structure and we have a dispute, we're not going to push everything to the courts. You need arbitration systems. You need models of lightweight arbitration. And we already have something of a foundation for this because ICANN, the Internet Corporation for the Assignment of Names and Numbers, and IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, these are multi-stakeholder institutions that have arbitration dispute mechanisms within them that are not actually, they don't reside necessarily in any particular legal framework. You have laws that are the eventual solution, the end game if you need to, but there's a mechanism when disputes and things come up. And it's multi-stakeholder. Of course, it began, both ICANN and IETF were initially, in some respects, seeded by the US government, and there was a US government role there, but they've moved over to almost totally multi-stakeholder situations now. They're run by volunteers. They are essentially not-for-profits. Obviously, all of these companies and there are governments and other institutions involved, but it's a framework that allows us to let the internet sort of go on with these tasks. Like ICANN assigns domain names. This is the real estate of the internet. It could be the most incredibly contentious thing, and it runs pretty well. So some people are thinking about, okay, the blockchain world needs something like this as well. Right? We're going to need an arbitration structure, something like an ICANN or anything like that. There was quite a good starting point on this by the World Economic Forum. This is Alex and Don Tapscott wrote a piece that I think looked at the history of the internet and tried to say this might be a model for it. It's ultimately pushing us towards a self-regulatory model that is nonetheless integrated with that whole meta-universe of law itself. a couple other points I just want to close on, and that is to say, we really need to think hard about over-regulation as well, right? As I mentioned, that the solution is not necessarily to regulate the blockchain, it is about figuring out how we can integrate all these systems together with things like arbitration models and everything else. And I'm just going to point out, if anybody is here from the New York Department of Financial Services, but I am going to say rather shamelessly that I think the bit license is a terrible law. And I think we've seen the impact of that, because there was an assumption built into that law. This was and it essentially regulated the technology, and it posed all these new burdens on the startups. And here's a chance. These startups are trying to build an innovative new way to break down the very costly, broken financial system that we currently work with. And then they were imposed upon them these very, very burdensome compliance costs, which effectively is a barrier to entry, which effectively therefore protects the existing incumbent system. And maybe we can be conspiratorial. New York's of course going to protect that system because that's where its wealth comes from. But the reason why I'm saying it's a bad law is because they didn't realize that those guys don't need New York anymore. And that's a really interesting point. This is the first time in history that you can run financial business, a money transmitting business or something like that, and be global. You can literally you can be in charge of moving money around the world and say to New York, I don't need you. Your correspondent banks, there was no way you could not be in New York before, because you had to have a relationship, or you had to at least have a relationship in New York, right? With a correspondent bank or an underwriter or any institution like that. But Kraken and Shapeshift, these two rather rebellious exchanges, just got into a rather snarky argument with the New York Department of Financial Services, because the Attorney General of New York sort of called them out for not responding to their subpoenas. And they said, we don't operate in New York. We have ring-fencing technology that we absolutely know does not have any New York residents using it. We're not regulated by you. You have absolutely no right to ask us to do anything. Why would you? Why on earth do I have to talk to you, right? That's a really hard thing for New York to deal with, because you always have to deal with New York, but you don't now, right? And I think if we expand this idea to the United States, it's a similar thing. The US for years was able to ignore this problem of regulatory arbitrage, the idea that technology creators would just choose one regime or jurisdiction over another, where they go to where the regulation is lightweight, right? Regulatory arbitrage, it's a real problem. But the US has said, nah, okay, I get it, it's an issue. It's not a big deal for us, because we're the United States. We have the biggest capital market in the world. You just have to play in our sandpit, I'm sorry. And they were right up until now. I really think that this technology, its mobility, its global nature, is a paradigm change in terms of that particular issue. I'm not saying that New York and the United States doesn't have significant clout, but there's an opening here that could make that equation different, right? So, and again, I'm not also saying that the US therefore has any great problem. I'm just saying this is a reason to think about harmonious approaches, global approaches, to figuring out what this legal regulatory framework needs to look like. If we all go it alone, it ultimately, and if we all care about protecting the existing financial system, because we probably should, then we want to know where both the good money and the bad money is going, right? So there needs to be this model that doesn't create this incentive for people just to flee everywhere. And the other last thing I just want to talk about is Lessig again. His real point, this code is law concept that he came up with, came out of an article that he wrote for the Harvard Business Review, I think it was. Might have been the Harvard Law Review. In any case, it was right on the very first day of January of the year 2000. And again, some people misunderstood, thought he was talking about an alternative world of law. What he really was saying was that, look, these regulatory environments that are now in a narrow subset of that, cyberspace, where code governs our behavior, we need to recognize that that's the way the world is, and that world is growing, and it's really important that we sort of try to figure out who is doing that, because it's like this is a really nice quote from the piece that I'm just going to read to you. He says, "To push the anti-government button is not to teleport us to Eden. When the interests of government are gone, other interests take their place. Do we know what those interests are? And are we so certain they are any better? than what we currently have, right? So the guys who are writing the laws, little l laws, the regulatory governance of cyberspace, and therefore I would also say of blockchains, are making choices about the code. They're the guys who, their choices are the ones that are dictating the governance model within that realm, right? And then they can have the best of intentions, but there's biases in them, right? I mean, there's a woman at MIT Media Lab who has done some fascinating work on how algorithms on facial recognition do not recognize people of color's faces, right? Essentially, the algorithm taking the biases of a white person has dictated what should be the law around that. This is a governance system. Blockchain's a governance system. We need to really think hard about who's writing them. And again, just in the case of those facial recognition, there's probably no malice involved in that. And there's probably no malice involved in how blockchains are going to be written. But this utopian kind of let Silicon Valley do its own thing and get out of the way because we'll fix it all for you is actually wrong. Because they can make some huge mistakes. If this is going to be a governance system for us, we need to ensure that we are there to shape that. A friend of mine, Lucien Tarnowski, talks about becoming slaves to the algorithm, and he compares it to Animal Farm, the classic Orwell book. And we believed wholeheartedly in this wonderful new solution for everything, and then that ideology took over and it destroyed us, right? So I don't want to be alarmist, because the point is that technology can be good or bad. It can be, a tool for good or a tool for evil. It could be a doomsday machine, or it could be something that does bring us closer to a utopia. But the bottom line is we all need to have input into it. And it doesn't mean that we'll have to become coders. This is not a pitch for STEM. It's partly that. Yes, we always need more coders. But it's also about being engaged in this real big meta discussion about how we interface this regulatory framework with the broad legal, big L law that is the fabric of our society. So I want people to just engage, talk, think. This is really, really important stuff. So that's why, I'm glad you invited me, Conan, and why this is a really important exercise, because we have to figure out what the relationship between blockchain and law is if we're going to make sure that this is a tool for good and not a tool for bad. So, thank you. Now you can have a drink.